Since the 16th century, the autocephalous Russian Orthodox Church has been a patriarchate and is headed by the Patriarch of Moscow and all Rus. Formally, the Church counts 16 patriarchs, including her current head, Patriarch Kirill. This number embraces two patriarchal periods separated by a 200-year gap, due to the abolishment of the Patriarchate by Peter the Great in the 18th century, until its restoration in the early days of Bolshevik Russia. Apart from the second Patriarch, Ignatiy, who is excluded from the official count of patriarchs for pledging allegiance to the impostor Tsar, false Dmitry, and later dethroned, the most controversial and much better known patriarch in the Russian Church history was Nikon. He led the Church in the mid-17th century, almost 4 centuries ago, but the impact his decisions have on the modern Church and Russian Christianity in general is tremendous. 3 main takeaways from his 14 years in power that are still relevant today are the struggle for political power between the state and the Church throughout the Russian history, the structural tension and conflict between the Church leadership, her bishops, and the main clerical body of priests, and of course the Great Church Schism that occurred because of the controversial reform initiated by Nikon. Just like with any other person living before the modern era, we have scarce data about Nikon's biography, heavily mixed with myth and rumors. The major source of his biography is an account written by his deacon, Ivan Shusherin. Apart from Nikon's life story, Shusherin also gave some important details about the liturgy and monastic life of that time. Future Patriarch was born Nikita Minin in a peasant family in 1605. He grew up in a small village in central Russia. Nikita's mother died soon after his birth, and his family barely made ends meet. Besides, his father remarried, and his stepmother abused the boy and even tried to kill him. Young Nikita settled in a nearby monastery where he learned to read and write and decided to dedicate his life to God and the Church. After the death of his father, Nikita got married and was ordained a priest. He served in one of the Moscow parishes. When all his children died in infancy, he decided to become a monk. He convinced his wife to become tonsured as a nun, too, and even compensated her expenses in a monastery. He himself got tonsured and received a monastic name, Nikon. In the 1630s, 1640s, Nikon dwelled in various monasteries, promptly progressing to a leadership position of a hegemon and an archimandrite. In 1646, after meeting the young Tsar Alexei, he entered the circle of his personal educators and spiritual advisors, known as Zealots of Piety, Ревнители благочестия. The circle included influential secular and church people. Many of the members of the circle, such as priest Avvakum, would become the leaders of the Church Schism, and some, like Nikon, their bitter rivals. Apart from their influence on Tsar Alexei, Zealots of Piety promoted social and church reforms, public morale, restoration of active church life, and enlightenment. In 1649, Nikon was ordained a bishop, a metropolitan of Novgorod, by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. His influence both in the church and in politics grew significantly. Nikon gained a reputation as a personal advisor to the Tsar and the defender of the poor and mistreated people. After the death of Patriarch Iosif, Nikon was proposed by the Tsar and Zealots of Piety, and in 1652 he was elected and enthroned. During his 14-year patriarchate, Nikon planted many new monasteries, actively participated in state and church governance, but he is mostly remembered for his controversial church reform. actively engaged in debates on authenticity and the purification of liturgy, Nikon became convinced that the Church's service books were corrupted over time. He considered Greek books authentic because Orthodox Christianity originated from the Greek Byzantine tradition. Later historians would demonstrate that in reality, Greek books were more substantially changed, sometimes under the influence of Roman Catholicism, but at that time the idea seemed reasonable. Apart from the correction of books, Nikon enforced actual changes in liturgy and rituals. One of these changes, the prohibition of the two-finger sign of a cross in favor of three fingers, became the most symbolic issue of the Great Schism. A significant part of the Church, led by a group of married priests, former members of Zealots of Piety, categorically rejected the reform. A two-finger sign of a cross became the symbol of resistance. The rebels, clerics or secular, were severely persecuted for this alone. The secular powers sided with Nikon and helped prosecute and harshly persecute schismatics. Eventually, the movement that kept the old ritual started off the whole denomination within Russian Christianity, known as Old Ritualists or Old Believers. Nowadays, there is no common church or community. Old Believers is an umbrella term for many different churches, concords, groups, and communities that oftentimes do not recognize each other. The only thing they have in common is adherence to the pre-Reform liturgy and church and the rejection of the Reform. Nikon's ambition skyrocketed, and he tried his best to restore the practice of one of his predecessors, Patriarch Filaret, of co-ruling the country with the Tsar in a seemingly harmonious symphonia. He co-signed state documents, adopted the title of the Great Sovereign, and considered the church power superior to the secular state. Unlike Patriarch Filaret, however, Nikon was not related to the Tsar by blood. Coming of age and growing in power, maturity and experience, Tsar Alexei's patience was wearing thin, and he became annoyed and threatened by Patriarch Nikon's ambition. The ruling aristocracy also saw Nikon as an obstacle to their influence on the monarch. In 1649, the Tsar issued a new legislation which significantly restricted the political influence and property rights of the church. Nikon's relationships with Tsar deteriorated and they distanced themselves from each other. Eventually, in 1658, Nikon publicly proclaimed his retirement and retreated to a monastery. He did not, however, formally surrender his throne. In 1666, with the support of the most important Eastern Patriarchs, the Great Church Council in Moscow dethroned Nikon and even defrocked him of his clerical status. A simple monk, he was exiled to a distant monastery. After being moved around different monasteries, Nikon died at the age of 76 in 1681. Alexei's son, Tsar Fyodor, sympathized with Nikon and restored his name in the list of patriarchs officially commemorated by the Church. So, why is Nikon important for the Church history and his influence is still relevant for the contemporary Russian Church? Naturally, his controversial church reform became a starting point for the Old Believers movement with a very rich diversity, history, and role in Russian Christianity. We can only guess whether some other event would be a catalyst for a great schism that gave birth to such a decentralized and diverse denomination of conservative adherents to the ancient church liturgy and tradition. Another important issue that can shed some light on the reasons for the schism, but also still going on in the modern church, is the tension between bishops and priests. Just two simple examples. The church reform of Nikon was overwhelmingly supported by bishops, with few exceptions, and categorically rejected by a group led by married priests. In today's church, the pro-war propaganda is actively or passively supported by the Patriarch and his bishops. At the same time, most of the dissidents who oppose the war are priests, the majority of whom are married. These two anecdotal examples refer to an important tension between those two levels of clergy. Clerics of the first level, deacons, are usually supplementary to priests and bishops in liturgy and church life. Priests and bishops, however, have very different functions and a huge disparity and inequality in terms of status, influence, and finances. Bishops are the church leadership. They accumulate power, financial resources, manage the church governance, and have the most political influence in their regions. Priests, on the other hand, are responsible for their parishes, where they directly serve the faithful and are engaged in countless ministries on the ground. Bishops have almost uncontrollable power over priests. They can freely move them around, control, promote, or downgrade. The church canons dictate almost total obedience to bishops by priests. Apart from that, Eastern Orthodox bishops are exclusively monastic. Although just a few of them have a real experience of monastic life, as I have explained in one of my videos, monastic tonsure and going through all stages of priesthood, if only formally, is a requirement for the ordination of a bishop. Orthodox priests could be both monastic and married, but the majority of parish priests are married. This not only significantly influences their lifestyle compared to life in celibacy and formal poverty, but also creates a glass ceiling for their church career. The highest rank of a married priest is protohierarchos. In Nikon's time it was called protopop. He can progress in an administrative career to the very top echelons of the Moscow Patriarchate, but a married priest becoming a bishop is more of an exception than a rule. In that case, he should either divorce his wife with the approval of his bishop or become a widower. Many influential bishops, including even some patriarchs, were married at some point, but again, this does not happen very often, and the reasons for their progression to a bishop usually have more to do with their influence than a monastic status per se. The Great Schism of the 17th century, after the controversial reform of Patriarch Nikon, is one of the key events in the church history that helps us understand what is going on within the church structures behind closed doors even today. Many media sources and politicians neglect this important factor when talking about the Russian Orthodox Church as just an institution under charismatic Patriarch Kirill. The Church is much more than that. Another critically important takeaway from Nikon's Patriarchate is the decline of Symphonia. The idea of a harmonious co-rulership of Russia by the Church Patriarch and secular monarch proved to be unrealistic. It was only attempted twice, during the rule of Tsar Mikhail Romanov and his son Alexei. Mikhail was elected as Tsar after a long, painful period of continuous unrest, civil war, and foreign intervention known as the Time of Troubles. It followed the interruption of the dynasty of Rurikovichi when the heir to the throne, Prince Dmitry, mysteriously died in infancy. Eventually, the new house of Romanovs was established, and it ruled Russia until the abdication of Nicholas II in 1917. Mikhail represented a powerful clan, but he himself was seen in the shadows of his influential father, Fyodor Romanov. At that time, however, Fyodor was in Polish captivity, and above all, he was forcefully tonsured a monk by his political rivals, and hence could not hold a political office. Eventually, upon his return to Russia, he became Patriarch Filaret and co-ruled Russia with his son until his death in 1633. Another attempt at Symphonia was made by Nikon, as I have described earlier. He did not have blood relations to the Tsar and most of all was way too ambitious. Nikon saw the role of the church as superior to the secular state and personally strived to control the Tsar and his political dominion. His conflict with Tsar Alexei became the beginning of the end of the church's political ambitions. Further, four patriarchs were mostly engaged in church's affairs and prosecuting old believers and were obedient to the state power. Eventually, Alexei's son, Peter the Great, held a radical church reform, abolishing the office of the Patriarch and turning the church into a state department. The church was ruled by the synod, headed by a secular officer, chief procurator. Peter's successors further stripped the church of her property rights and influence. Eventually, bishops were meant to act as some sort of government officials, and most priests were uneducated and lived in poverty. To a large extent, nowadays, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the situation is quite similar. To sum up, Patriarch Nikon became one of the most controversial figures in the history of the Russian Church and Russian Christianity in general. His tenure and his decisions symbolize the Great Church Schism, the decline of the Church's political authority, and the conflict within the Church structures. As is usually the case, he himself was just a frontman, a charismatic leader associated with tectonic shifts and large-scale processes, which could not be completely blamed on him alone. I hope this account of Nikon's life and patriarchate will help you to understand Russian Church history a little bit better. Please like the video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you all next time.